we must degrade ISIL. That's why, Mr. Speaker, we seek the support of this House for our decision to extend and expand Canada's military mission for up to a year. We ask that the Canadian Armed Forces conduct airstrikes against ISIL targets in Syria on the same basis as our coalition allies. When Canadian values and Canadian citizens are under siege, we cannot afford to stand on the sidelines and preach moral virtue. I urge all members of the House to support this motion. Thank you very much.
I didn't hear anything in the minister's comments that would clarify what the on-the-ground objectives are. I mean, degrading ISIL is pretty broad.
Canada's expanding war against ISIS. I'm Brian Lilley with TheRebel.media. The debate is officially underway in the House of Commons, although, let's face it, the debate about Canada's mission has been going on for months. The expansion debate has been going on for the last few days since the Harper government announced their plans to expand our mission into Syria. Now, one of the big questions is this move legally justified? Does Canada have international law on its side? Well, besides being able to rely upon the fact that the U.S. is already engaged in this, that they claim it's legal, that they've gone to the United Nations with that argument, Defense Minister Jason Kenney says he's spoken to the military's top lawyer and says Canada is on solid legal ground.
It is the view of the Judge Advocate General, with which I agree, that our military operations in Syria are justified under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, specifically the right of independent and collective self-defense. Iraq, the sovereign democratically elected government of Iraq, has asked Canada and allied countries to help them defend their innocent civilians from terror attacks being launched out of eastern Syria in a part of that country which the Syrian government either is unwilling or unable to control.
Now, of course, that idea that Canada's on solid legal ground isn't bought by the NDP. Their leader, Tom Mulcair, says Canada is not only in violation of international law, but he's worried about the unintended consequences of helping Syria's brutal dictator.
Again, they tried yesterday, you heard them using words unwilling or unable. That's a condition precedent to being able to use that one. I mean, it's a construction, but in terms of international law, their case is extremely feeble. That's why Stephen Harper was incapable of providing even the beginning of a response on this issue of what's the legality of Canada's intervention there. Don't forget, we're helping a bloody dictator. Assad has been using, and has been shown by the United Nations to have been using chemical weapons against his own civilian population. I find it shameful that Canada should, in any way, shape, or form, be putting our brave women and men in uniform at the beck and call of someone like Assad. Helping Assad is shameful. We should not be doing it.
Is that a fair characterization?
Liberal leader Justin Trudeau is feeling much the same way. He's actually sounding an awful lot like Mulcair when he speaks about Canada's participation and expansion into Syria.
The legal aspect of
obviously, I'm concerned with the legality of the way they've invoked Article 51 of the UN Charter. But for me, it's really more about the fact that this mission hasn't been properly thought through and is going to have unintended consequences for Bashar al-Assad.
So is this the big concern that everyone needs to be worried about, whether Canada's bombing of terrorists across the Syrian border is legal? Well, if you don't buy the argument from the Judge Advocate General of the Canadian military or Defense Minister Jason Kenney, and you continue to ask questions, well, you might hear something like this from Prime Minister Stephen Harper.
The government is pursuing this action on exactly the same legal basis as its allies, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure what point the leader of the NDP is ultimately making if he is suggesting, Mr. Speaker, that there is any significant legal risk to lawyers from ISIL taking the government of Canada to court and winning. The government of Canada's view is that the chances of that, Mr. Speaker, are negligible. We are clearly defending not only the wider
Funny quips aside, there is also the question of, will Canada be inadvertently helping the Assad regime? Bombing ISIS, one of the groups fighting against Assad could inadvertently help Assad. That's not something most Canadians want to do. Now, I put that question to Defense Minister Jason Kenney.
We should not allow our opposition to the Assad regime to give this genocidal terrorist organization a safe haven in parts of the country that Bashar al-Assad either refuses to or cannot control. The Syrian civil war is a humanitarian disaster, but it's a multi-sided civil war. We are not picking sides in that civil war. We are picking the side of the vulnerable minority communities in eastern Syria and much of Iraq who have been subject to a campaign of genocide from this organization. And we will not allow some exaggerated idea of Westphalian sovereignty to prevent us from necessary humanitarian action to defeat that organization.
We have to face reality. We could end up helping Assad, but I don't think that that is the purpose of Canada bombing ISIS. I don't think that's the purpose of the Obama administration bombing ISIS. This is a brutal group that has oppressed people throughout the region. They have moved their troops, their equipment across the Iraq-Syria border onto the Syrian side because they're facing less pushback there. Is this a mission that Canada should be taking on? Well, I've supported the idea of bombing ISIS back into the 7th century that they desperately want to live in. But one thing we have to be careful of is mission creep. Will we get into a 10-year slog the way we were in Afghanistan? Will we get into nation building in an area that doesn't seem to want to build nations? Those are the things we have to worry about more than the idea that bombing terrorists who snuck across the border might violate an international law propped up by a body that does nothing to stop brutal dictators like Assad or Mugabe or Kim Jong-un. I think those are the real worries and not academic questions about international law.